the shocking murder of two journalists on a live television program in Virginia in America. And the suicide by their assailant has once again put gun crime at the top of the American news agenda. It has raised the question, why do these kinds of violent crimes happen so often in the United States? US President Barack Obama says he is heartbroken over the deaths. He's publicly stated that Americans are overly focused on terrorism at a time when more deaths are being caused by gun violence. But the shootings continue. For instance, 3 people were killed and at least 25 others, including a 7-year-old girl, wounded in gun attacks across Chicago. These underline the shooting epidemic that has struck the United States, which now leads the world in mass shootings. Across the last 50 years, this nation, with 5% of the world's population, has suffered almost 1/3 of all gun-related massacres. And towards the end of August 2015, according to the website Mass Shoot Tracker, there had been 247 instances of mass shootings in just 238 days, which on average is more than 1 a day. Has US gun violence become a part of mainstream American society? Why is the US so violent? And is America any longer in a position to lecture other countries about how to run their societies? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, in Chicago, shootings have caused the deaths of 3 people and injured over 25 others, including a 7-year-old girl. What worries you most? That the shootings injured so many people, or that the victims included a 7-year-old girl? That's what we asked the American public.
I think a life is a life, whether it's a young life or someone older. That's what's most important.
I would say the victims include the 7-year-old girl. I mean, that's pretty bad.
The 7-year-old girl, yes. I believe that violence should actually not be involved in so much of police brutality. I believe it should actually be controlled. And I think the police academy should be retrained. I think that's what should be the better format to say. I think it's basically because I think they're starting to abuse of their authority towards civilians. That's basically.
We're talking mainly just about gun violence in general, not necessarily from police, but.
But I mean, gun violence basically begins with them because they have a little bit of authority over us. So if we see that they have the authority, we starting to believe that we have that same authority. And it's basically like a cycle. It's like a non-ending cycle. Because they could do it, that means we can do it too. And it's always an imbalance in regards of it.
Really? The child, you know what I mean? I mean, the government practice population control with everything from cigarettes to the laws that we have in our country.
I think the 7-year-old girls are relevant. That they just put that in there just to stir up the anti-gun lobby and all of that. It's all a bunch of crap.
Probably that the shootings included so many people, just because it's like a lot of people that don't get to live anymore, and that's so sad.
So many people of all ages. Mm-hmm.
It all worried me because the victim was killed and those others were injured. They just had a mayor election in Chicago. I think we need to focus on gun control. Public safety would be an issue, and making sure we have programs for young people that has been so badly cut by local municipalities and mayors across the country.
I think that it included a 7-year-old girl.
Obviously it's terrible that it was a young person, but anyone getting shot, for a crime like for gun violence is awful. I don't think there's really worse or better. I think it's all objectively terrible.
I think more just broadly. I think about the problems we have in this country with shootings, and I think it's twofold. Yes, guns are too readily available. We need to do something about that. But I also think that in the United States we have a gun culture, and it's in our video games, it's in our movies. There is a demand, and we stimulate the demand for the guns in the culture because the culture is loaded with violence. And then, of course, the United States government is the biggest arms dealer in the whole world. So it works perfectly, right, for business, but we have too many shootings.
No, it's both. Not exclusively one, experience or another.
Those are the views of the public. We asked our experts if they were more concerned about the number of victims of shootings or the fact that the youngest victim was just 7 years old.
Obviously, the killing of a 7-year-old girl is incredibly tragic, but this rhetoric of deserving and undeserving victims is not a positive one. It assumes that certain people deserve to be shot and certain people don't. And I think that we have to value each human life and each person who's a victim of these crimes. And while that particular girl is absolutely tragic, so is everyone else who is injured and everyone else who has been killed.
Well, both, of course. But the fact that children are subjugated to this type of violence and exposed to it is a crime in itself that occurs all across the globe. The difference is that the U.S. in itself, these mass shootings target schools and offices, shopping malls, so it just shows in the nature of these shootings that there's no consideration who's there and who's not. So young children are mostly exposed to these type of shootings in the U.S.
The shooting of 2 journalists on live US TV in Virginia has renewed the debate about US gun violence. We asked the public if they believed that gun violence was now a part of mainstream American society.
I mean, maybe you get a lot of video games and a lot of movies that incorporate gun violence, but at the same time, it's kind of difficult when that's very much what people are interested in. It's kind of difficult to kind of separate that to an extent.
I think it has due to the media, like music and stuff, but I'm sure it depends where exactly in the U.S., like what area. Guns have probably, they're worse like down south, I would think.
Yes, of course it's part of mainstream American society. Gun violence has been part of mainstream American society for more than 20 or 30 years.
I believe so, because it's in our music, our TV, Facebook, it's everywhere.
No, I don't think so. Just some people who have issues take it out on others. I don't think it's an issue around the country. I just think that it goes back to gun control again. Let's find a way to come up with some better solutions on gun control.
Just like it is anywhere, man. What about all the gun violence the United States perpetrates in other countries and it ain't being broadcast anywhere? When they're bombing innocent people in other countries, do they put that on TV? When they're bombing innocent journalists in Afghanistan or Iraq, do you see that on TV? No.
Seeing gun violence is part of mainstream American society, unfortunately. Seeing it, not doing it.
I certainly hope not. It's more common, but I certainly hope it's not.
Yeah, because it happens so often, and it's almost people are getting less shocked as it happens more and more. So it's just, I mean, obviously no one should be used to it. I'm not used to it, but it is becoming a fixture, and it's a horrific thing to have to just hear about all the time.
I think it has, like, what with the Sandy Hook shooting and everything, and it's only happening in the U.S. as well. Like, that stuff isn't happening elsewhere. It's not happening even in Canada, right? So I think it has to do for sure with the laws.
I think we should be embarrassed because in the rest of the world, they have better policies about guns. I don't think anyone other than military or police enforcement should have guns. No guns at all.
Yes, it definitely has. Because it's like now it's on live TV. It's not just like it's recorded or it's not like it's just happened. It's happened on live TV. So maybe it's like people don't want it to be known, but it's just happening.
In the view of our experts, how much a part of American mainstream society has gun crime become?
I think gun violence has always been a part of American society in the last 50 years. What we see, though, is this violence spilling into traditional areas where it's not meant to be. So we've always been fine, essentially, with this violence plaguing poverty-stricken communities, plaguing the poor. But when it spills into white communities, spills into the suburbs, suddenly it becomes an international headline. So while it is obviously important to kind of take these horrible, horrible sort of psychotic shootings into account, we should also be aware that violence is a daily plague in many communities in the United States and has been part of their mainstream for a very long time.
Yes, big time. And quite obviously, you can see that the notion of owning a gun has completely been glamorized. It's seen as a symbol of power, and most of that you can blame Hollywood, mainstream television, and music, and video games, just the fact that they've normalized the concept of owning a gun and shootings and killings. Other than that, around 47% of people in the US own guns, and a lot of them will argue that they have the right to own a gun out of self-defense.
A study has shown that on average there has been one mass shooting per day in the US since the beginning of 2015. What does that say about the state of American society? We put that to the public.
It's bad, all bad. It's not good. I mean, that's the most I could really say on it, you know?
I don't know if it says something about society, that just there are crazy people, and guns are definitely too available.
That's pretty bad, actually. If it's every single day, literally, yeah, that's pretty bad, yeah.
It's a crazy place, but fun to live.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a good statistic. It certainly does seem like it's increasing. You definitely do hear a lot about it, and, you know, it's not really, the statistic isn't really supporting otherwise in any way.
No, I don't think so. Just some people who have issues take it out on others. I don't think it's an issue around the country. I just think that it goes back to gun control again. Let's find a way to come up with some better solutions on gun control.
One mass murder per day, that means that more than 4 people were killed, I think, at one time by the same gun. What does that say about American society at this time? Lack of care, lack of compassion, lack of empathy, a very self-absorbed mentality and culture, and you know, a lot of loose guns and not strict enough laws.
You know, obviously this is a gun issue, like with our laws and legislation, but I also think there's underlying issues with people emotionally and socially, and I think people don't really address mental illness in schools, and there's a million red flags that people show before that. So anytime these guys have these shootings and these, you know, people, there's always some story that leads up to it. So I think we need to address that in a very specific way, in an interpersonal way, and obviously the gun laws need to change as well.
We have a problem in our society. It's a regular occurrence.
It's unstable and it's uncontrolled.
The gun laws should be changed for sure, because the guns aren't being used properly for what they're on the market for. They're being used to kill, not protect.
What can we learn about American society from the almost daily mass shootings? Our experts said this.
Well, US society clearly has some problems related to gun violence. We see a mix of poverty, a mix of a kind of militarized macho culture that celebrates violence and celebrates a sort of shoot first, ask questions later approach to solving problems. And that, combined with a very kind of alienated society, creates a lot of problems and almost inevitably leads to the sort of situations that we see with gun violence plaguing US society.
What it says, especially in comparison, well, if you compare the difference between other countries who are actually in war zones and people are in threat or actually in self-defense, the US, you can argue, is highly psychological, and a lot of investigators will argue that it's mental illness, which there is some truth to that, but it's much more than that, in the sense is that the US society has succeeded so well in alienating so many people of their citizens, and that has breeded a group of citizens who are completely, basically alienated, and it's what leads to this type of behavior in many cases, unfortunately.
Another study found that the US is by far the global leader in mass shootings, with nearly a third of all gun-related massacres across the last 50 years. Could the public explain why the US has become so violent?
I don't know what it is exactly. Obviously, it's very easy to get guns. That's a huge problem. You know, anyone over the age of 18 can get it. That kid, Dylan Roof, got one when he was 21. So I think that obviously doesn't help. And, you know, I guess the emotional and psychological issues behind it, I couldn't speak on that. But just the fact that it's so easy to get guns is definitely a huge issue.
I believe the U.S. is so violent because we don't know how to mind our own business. You know, we got problems going on within our own country, but we worried about everybody else, while everybody else is trying to be us. So it's a big confusion thing, you know. The rest of the world's mad at us. The rest of the world just wants us to deal with our own problems.
I think you can go back to the Constitution, the right to bear arms. I think that's obsolete now. We have too many dangerous weapons, and it should be modified in some way that You have the right to bear arms if you're protecting the country, if you're hired as a law enforcement officer, if you work in the military, if you have a career where you need a gun.
I would, like I said earlier, I think it's the media. I think it's movies, music, a lot of influence from the media, you know?
The economy is what's making it really violent. It's because everyone is basically trying to find a way to live. So they think violence is the format into which they could get their way.
Probably because it's just so greed and media driven. That's what it is, man.
I think there are just too many guns. A lot of people, too many guns.
I think it's the gun culture. We've always had this culture, you know, the violence, the Wild West and all that, but it's been taken to a new level. We have affluence in general, although it's very unevenly distributed, but everyone pretty much has access to the consumption of violence, whether it be through movies, Netflix, video games, and people just, you know, when they're young, they're more impressionable and they get too comfortable with the idea of shooting a human being. Like when I was a kid playing video games, it was a little different. Play Mario Brothers or something, or even the duck hunt with shooting the ducks. You weren't shooting people. Not that I advocate shooting ducks either.
I don't think the U.S. is so violent. I think we commit a few crimes and people spew these numbers and say we don't know for sure that those numbers are accurate, because they say unemployment is so and so and so and so, and those numbers we find out those numbers are not accurate.
I'm not sure. I guess the fact that guns are so available to the public, and there's not even a license really to buy them.
Well, we came from a violent history, and it's part of our culture.
I think it actually may have something to do with the fact that guns are so easily available. You know, a lot of other countries like Norway and, for example, Iceland, who only recently had their first police-related shooting, it's weird that it might just be because it's so rooted in your constitution, or if guns are so easily available. But you know, either way, it kind of all adds up to a major problem in the U.S.
With America at the top of the international table for mass shootings, we invited our experts to consider the causes of this extraordinary level of lethal violence in the United States.
Well, again, I would return, when looking to this violence, this sort of militarized culture we see. We see this celebration of violence in films, but also through politics, through the use of military as a first solution to solving international problems. And when that's the sort of rhetoric that's coming from every direction, that you solve problems through violence, people internalize that and they think that their own problems can be solved through violence.
What makes the U.S. so violent is, we can say quite a few things, but an important thing to focus on is the concept of gender and race. Aside from all other type of gun violence that occurs between gang members or police and civilians, mass shootings in itself is known to be 97% male and 79% white. So you realize there's a lot of actually aggression and sexism related to these shootings, which is a big epidemic that needs to be focused on.
US mass shootings have been described as a uniquely American phenomenon. Should the US still be lecturing other countries about how to run their societies? We put that question to the American public.
I don't believe so, because from what I've seen in other countries, gun violence, you know, in third world countries and whatnot, is 10 times worse. So I don't feel so.
Well, I'm not sure that we're exactly lecturing other countries about how to run their societies, but I think we all can learn from each other's cultures and be open to learning and teaching. I don't think that having a violent, out of control, runaway trained violent society in America with guns and so forth excludes us from being capable of having some wisdom.
No, because I think if they can't even run their own country, why are you giving an opinion than everybody else's?
Well, I think there are some things that we do well. So there are some things that we can comment on where we see injustice. But with that also comes tremendous responsibility, and we need to look inside our own house first, clean up some of our problems here too.
The U.S. should be overthrown, and some other countries should come in here and lecture the U.S. how to run their own country.
I think America does have things to offer to other societies and vice versa. I think Iceland has never had I don't know, there's a lot of countries that really don't deal with this issue. Like Japan has one of the lowest gun violence crime rates in the world. So yeah, we could definitely learn a lot based on their legislation and how they handle gun laws and even people with emotional issues.
It's an interesting question. I mean, the U.S. does many things well, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that can also be improved. So, on one hand, yes, I think with a lot of the infrastructure that the U.S. has, but on the other hand, with things such as violence and police aggression, I think that the U.S. has almost no authority.
That's a tough question. I can't answer that.
I don't believe so. I don't believe so because we got to correct our own problem at home instead of going over other countries and getting in their business and then going to war with them and stealing their stuff and then dropping, thousands and hundreds of dollars of food packages while we got people on the West Coast starving and we got people living in train stations in New York and all that.
No, I don't think so.
Can you talk further on that?
Well, I think that's hypocritical for them to do so, considering the amount of violence that's happening here on their own turf. So,
Should the US lecture other countries about how they should run their societies? Our experts gave their opinions.
Well, I don't think it's the role of any government to lecture another country on how to run their society. And I think this is particularly the case in the United States, where we've seen interventions throughout history that have been detrimental, that have damaged the cultures of individual countries. And so I think that the US's main priority, and particularly the priority of the United States government, should be to solve the problems of the United States and not intervene abroad and not try to kind of dictate what other countries do.
Not only should they not be lecturing other countries, they should stop exporting their violence to other countries and funding and gun trade and weapon trade, all that they're responsible for, and they are funding most of the violence that actually is occurring across the globe. So once they cut that down and probably decrease the number of gun ownership within their own country, they can maybe start talking. But till then, they should probably keep their mouth shut.
The US leads the world in mass shootings and gun violence. Indeed, by August 2015, more American citizens had been killed and injured by mass shootings within America's own borders than had fallen victim to terrorist action across the rest of the entire planet. And still, the tragic death toll continues to rise, with America apparently powerless to prevent this carnage on its own doorstep. This has caused many to suggest that the US ought to resist lecturing other countries on how to run their societies without violence until it can peacefully run its own.